Welcome to this week's podcast where I am going to talk to you all about how to say no. No. It's like one of the shortest words in the alphabet, in in the alphabet, in our British language, English language. And yet so many of us really struggle to say it. It really brings up a panic in us, the thought of saying no to someone. So I really thought, especially as working mums, learning how to say no in a very loving, a very compassionate, um, and a very grounded way is a really vital skill. And I say it's a skill because this is something that you've probably never been taught. You've certainly never practiced. And you are now in this repetitive habit of saying yes to shit that you don't actually want to do. So, oh my gosh, I could come up with so many examples of what you're saying yes to that you don't want to do. And it could be work, it could be personal, but it's things like maybe a client or a manager comes and asks you to do something and you don't actually have time, but you're like, oh yes, of course I'll do that. Or your neighbor asks you to look after their cat and you've got loads of stuff going on. You're like, yes, of course, I'd love to look after your cat. Um, it could be you will have it in your life. I don't need to give you all the examples of where you're saying yes when actually you really want to be saying no. Now, there's kind of two parts to this. There's actually looking at the discomfort of saying no, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this episode. But also, I think it's worth noting when we actually look at a task, sometimes we do want to actually do it. The thing that's popping into my head right now is cooking healthy meals for my kids. Oh my gosh. I got to be honest with you. I get to the point where I'm like, really, this is so dull. This is boring. I'm spending so much effort trying to come up with healthy meals that they don't really want to eat. But like, there's part of me that's like, oh, I just don't want to do this anymore. Now, I could say no to that. And actually, recently, I said to my family, by the way, I don't cook anymore on a Sunday. I've made the decision that on a Sunday, I just don't cook. Um, Now, my children are a little bit older. They're 12 and 13 at the point of recording this podcast episode. So they're able to, put some oven chips in or scrambled egg or make an omelette, cook some bacon, heat some baked beans on toast. Like they are actually capable of looking after themselves. And my husband is 100% capable of looking after ourselves. But I do think, and I'm going to do another podcast episode on this, I do think we don't let them. Um, I do think there's an underlying belief that we think our men are incapable, our husbands are incapable, and they're not. They're actually not. I'm not going to rant about that today, although I could rant about that. Keep an eye out for that podcast. But we don't say no to things. A lot of us don't say no. And then what happens is we become really uncomfortable, either doing something that we don't want to do or taking on more work and stressing ourselves out. So, what I find absolutely fascinating. Oh, I was going to say, sorry, actually, off the bat, going back to the cooking, doing the do I actually want it? Yes, I get bored of trying to cook healthy meals and come up with inspiration. But actually, when I look at it, that is something that I actually want to do. So when you find yourself saying, I have to be there, I have to do this, I have to look after that person, I have to write that report, I have to take that task, do you? Do you? And might it be truer to say, I want to? So just that simple shift of swapping I have to I want to makes a huge difference in how we feel. So, first of all, just get honest with yourself. Do you want to show up as this person that can do it and helpful? Like, do I want to help my neighbors with their cats? Yeah, actually, I do. So then please stop torturing yourself by moaning that you have to do it because you don't. You could have said no. So there's one bit. But let's look at the psychology for just a second of saying no. Now, there's a book by Sarah Knight called, and it's literally called Fuck No. Like she's author also of the bestseller The Life-Changing Magic of Not Giving a Fuck. So you can see the terminology and the humor that this book is going to bring. Personally, I haven't actually read all of the book yet. I can't say that I've sat down and read all of it. But what I really like at the beginning of the book is how she categorizes into four different four different people, basically, when it comes to saying no. And they are the people pleaser, the overachiever, the FOMOer, and the pushover. So the people pleaser being that person who really doesn't like to upset people. Oh, I really don't want them to feel disappointed. I really don't want them to be upset. So I'm going to say yes, and that will make them happy. That's kind of the people pleaser. The overachiever, or I quite like to think of it also as the perfectionist, kind of sounds like I I have to do it, or I must as well do it because no one else can do it as good as me. I have to do it because I'll do it best. I'll do it the right way. The FOMOer, and I think this is where I sit, people pleasing a little bit, but definitely FOMO is this fear of missing out, right? I'm afraid that if I say no, what might happen? What might I miss out on? Or what might be the consequence? So the fear, the FOMO, the fear of missing out. And then the pushover. The pushover really dislikes confrontation. It's like I'm going to say yes because that's easier than having any kind of backlash or confrontation or challenging conversation if I were to say no. So there's no judgment when I read these sort of traits out to you. Just notice where you think you sit most often with just fascination and awareness. Because once you're aware of why you're not saying no, then you get to change what you're doing. If you don't have the awareness, you don't know what to change. So, and if you're struggling with that awareness, that's where a life coach comes in. Pick up the phone, give me a call, let's have a chat, because that is the awareness that you need before you can even move forward to changing it. Really, like I said, no judgment, just pure fascination. So just become aware, like which one do you think you sit under? And what I'd like to point out to you is every single one of those traits is just a protective mechanism. And this is where compassion comes in. When you consider that that primitive part of your brain literally thinks that being excluded from the pack meant death, it kind of made sense that we wanted to please everybody around us, that we wanted to avoid any form of confrontation, that we wanted everything to be perfect, and that we didn't want to miss out on anything because if that had been the case hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would have perished. So I really believe that there is a primitive part in all of us that wants to be included, that wants to please people. That's not an excuse. That is just a reason to have absolute compassion with yourself when your brain is really wanting to say yes to something that you don't want to do. Isn't that fascinating? And just comfort yourself. I get it. I get it. So I've said before about naming your primal brain. Name your primal brain because then you can comfort it. That primitive part of us is the average age of a 5-year-old. So imagine comforting a 5-year-old. And so mine's called Sue. So I'm like, Sue, I get it. I get it. You quite literally think something's bad's going to happen if we say no. You really think that having a challenging conversation is going to be life threatening. I get it. I understand. But it's not actually true. A lot of the time, when we're thinking about saying no to someone, it is not a life threatening situation. Quite the reverse. Really, quite the opposite. That is a life enhancing situation. Because the growth of you being able to say no means that you're not as stressed, you're not as overwhelmed. And not being overwhelmed means you're more present with your kids. You're becoming a version of you that you want to be. The other side of that discomfort is self-confidence. And that is something that all of us would like a little bit more of. The other thing that I find absolutely fascinating about the ability to not say no to something is we think we're avoiding a discomfort. We think that by saying yes is the most comfortable thing to do. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it actually isn't. I know of somebody, because she couldn't say no, she ended up spending 4 days on a holiday doing something that she didn't want to do because she couldn't be uncomfortable for 5 minutes saying no, thank you. Isn't that crazy? And if you bring this into the workplace, the temporary discomfort of saying to your colleague, higher or lower, no, requires a temporary discomfort for a few minutes while your brain freaks out, thinks you're about to die. What it doesn't consider is the discomfort of you taking on that task. Doesn't think of that discomfort. Doesn't think about how long you've got to be uncomfortable for when you're actually saying yes to something, the period of time you've got to do that something that you've said yes to. I go back to my neighbour's cats. Quite often, she will ask us if we can feed her cats. Personally, I'm not a cat fan. My son loves cats. So I want to be the type of neighbour that helps her out. So I'm happy to say yes. But if I were to say no, and in that moment, which I do sometimes, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't actually do it that weekend. We're already busy. Or I don't even have to have an excuse. I don't want to do it that weekend. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't that weekend. I know that for that short 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to feel uncomfortable because my brain freaks out thinking I'm about to die. And that's okay. I would much rather be uncomfortable for 3 minutes than try and cram in feeding cats twice a day over a weekend that's already fully packed. So actually, you get to choose your discomfort here. You get to choose whether you want to be uncomfortable for a few short temporary minutes whilst you say no, or you could try no, thank you, or you could try thank you for asking, but not this time. You don't actually have to just go no. There is with, if you're being I was going to say bitchy about it, but I don't mean bitchy because that's unfair. But if you're defensive and you're frustrated and you're in your survival state, um, the no is going to sound, it's going to sound bitchy, but and you don't, that's not the intention that you mean it with. So it's about catching yourself, going, right, okay, this is what's happening. I'm going to choose my discomfort, take a deep breath. I want to evolve. So instead of going no or oh God, if I have to, you could be like, deep breath. What would Nikki do? Nikki would say, thank you so much for thinking of me, but I'm not going to come this time. Or thank you for asking me. I've actually got quite a lot to do. So please ask someone else. Or, when you take a deep breath and you check in with yourself and you come from compassion for you and the other person, the words will come. You don't necessarily think about exactly what to say. You just need to feel compassion. But you do get to decide. You do get to choose your discomfort. So what you're actually choosing is whether you want to be uncomfortable temporarily in saying no, or really uncomfortable for a further prolonged period of time when you have to do the thing that you said yes to. Or I think what's even worse, and actually, come on, guys, really quite funny, is then when we say yes, and then we're like, shit, now I have to come up with a reason and an excuse and something. I have to try and come up with something that gets me out of it. And so then we start going into this lying spiral where you could just be, and again, no judgment. I've done it. I've been there. I used to say yes to all the shit. Um, I don't do that anymore. Literally, I'm just like, no. Thanks, but I'm not going to do it this time. Whatever comes up, but I do it with compassion. I don't do it from a defensive, they shouldn't be asking energy. I do it from a, of course they're asking, and that's okay, but I get to choose my discomfort. I would rather be uncomfortable for 5 minutes saying no than be uncomfortable for the 4 days of doing something or the 2 hours of doing something that I don't want to do. So, just being aware that your brain is trying to protect you, you don't actually need protecting because saying no isn't life threatening. It can actually be very life enhancing. And just be aware that you are choosing your discomfort. So, you get to decide. And if you choose to say yes, don't then beat yourself up for being like that because that's just adding more torture onto the situation. Just be like, oh, isn't that interesting? I didn't say no again. That's interesting. Let's just explore why that was. Well, I didn't want to upset them. I didn't want them to be disappointed. But you do get to decide if that's the type of person you want to show up as. And if it isn't, choose something different. So I have a challenge for you. You could call it the day of a day, the dare of the day. You could call it the 100 like challenge, no challenge. You call it whatever you want. But the only way you're going to learn and your primal brain is going to learn that saying no is okay is to actually do it. And and it's really simple. This is how it sounds. No. Practice with me now. Everybody, if you're driving, if you're walking, if you're making the tea, just practice for a second going, taking a deep breath, saying no. Or no, thank you. Or, oh, thank you for thinking of me, but I won't this time. But ask me next time, yeah? Just practice that for a second. You will notice you have not crashed your car because you've said no. You have not suddenly burnt the potatoes because you said no. You have not tripped over into a hole or into the river that you're walking past because you've said no. Actually, probably quite the opposite. Because especially if you're cooking tea, and you're like trying to do a million things at once and you're saying yes to everyone and you're trying to focus on your husband and you're trying instead of saying I can't talk to you right now, can you come back in a minute while you know no, I can't talk to you right now. um you end up then the peas boil over and you forget to put the veg on or and then a whole load more shit has come up just because you couldn't say no. And it's ironic, isn't it? We do this to our children all the time. We are saying no to them all the time. So we can say no. Saying no isn't a problem. It's the bullshit that your brain comes up with because you're saying no. And that's the optional bit. So the dare of the day is I dare you to say no to something today. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be huge, but just practice feeling the discomfort and saying, no, thank you. Or, oh, that's a really kind offer, but I won't this time. Keep me in mind for next time. Thank you. Or if it's a manager or a work colleague, especially if it's a manager, we quite often think that because our manager is asking, we have to do it. But that remember that that manager is also human, so they're probably living out of their primitive brain because of their limiting beliefs and their shitty primal brain. They're human too. But you get to say to them, okay, if I did that thing, these jobs are going to be affected. Are you happy with that? And if they're like, no, well then I am afraid I haven't got the resource right now. That is no reflection on you. You can say no because if you keep saying yes, the people around you don't realize there's a problem. So you're creating more discomfort with for yourself because you're not willing to say no. So the dare of the day is to say no to something. Say no to something. Make this things that you don't want to do, right? If you want to do something, say yes, do it, of course. But if you really don't, practice saying no. And what I'd love to challenge you to do is come up, like challenge your brain, because the brain loves achievement, right? Challenge yourself to get to 100 no's. Tick them off every time you go. Like I said no 5 times today. It might be, can I borrow your pen? Oh, no, I'm using it. It could be something that simple. But just challenge yourself to say no. Because when you get to 100, when you've said no 100 times, you will start to learn that saying no isn't a problem. Whereas actually continuing to say yes to things is causing you a problem. So I hope that helps. I'll just recap. Saying no isn't life threatening, it can be actually very life enhancing. It's a protective mechanism, say, feeling like you have to say yes to everything and challenge yourself every day to say no. Give yourself that dare of the day. See if you can get to 100 no's. Be very interesting. And look, if you do struggle with this or you do want any more help with it, get in touch because, I'm getting a bit of a badass at this actually. Because I've practiced. It's a skill. You're going to be shit at it. Let yourself be shit at it. Even the perfectionists amongst you, it's just a protective mechanism. Have an amazing week, and I'll speak to you all next week. Bye.